My name is Lynne Marshall. Thank you so much for the opportunity to tell you about my 3 times great-grandmother in this case study entitled Margarett Booker, From Enslaved to Free During the Civil War. My motto is, if we want an inclusive American history, we must research and write our history. Even though family lore from 1976 provided a few thrilling clues about my 3 times great-grandmother Margarett Booker, there were too many missing pieces to write her life story. This case study will reveal the ins and outs, wrong turns, suppositions, and irrefutable evidence I was finally able to discover after 40 years of trying to crack the Margarett Booker code. Tighten your seatbelts. It's going to be a wild ride through West Virginia to Ohio. My passion for genealogy began in 1976 when my great-uncle George Booker and his wife Geraldine became my cross-country pen pals. They charted our maternal lineage on legal-size paper and mailed me a new page every month from Mount Vernon, Ohio, my mother's birthplace. In this note, they explained they forgot to say the Earl, who was the slave owner to the African woman, was a white German. I didn't know what that meant. I had to figure it out over many, many years. My California family flew from Sacramento to Ohio for our first family reunion in July 1983. 100 members of the Booker, Carter, Jenkins, Myers, and Williams families met at Mohican State Park in Ohio. Our family historian, Myrtle Lavada Williams, recreated booklets for each family who attended. The 22-page treasure included traditional genealogical details such as marriages, births, and deaths. This story captured my heart for decades and became the focus of my award-winning book, The Mystery of Margarett Booker, which we will explore today. Let me read this for you. After President Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863, the plantation owner freed Margarett Booker and her 5 children, and he also gave her a buckboard and I assume the horse that pulled the wagon. This is being written by Lavada Williams. 4 of her children, Cornelia, George, May, and Ella, resided with her on the plantation, but Joseph, who was originally called Job Booker, was around 10 years old, had been farmed out. Margaret and her 4 children climbed aboard the buckboard and drove to the plantation where her oldest child Joseph was on loan. Now having her 5 children, she left Beverly, Virginia, now West Virginia due to the split of Virginia over the Civil War, and headed north. They traveled by day and slept under the buckboard nights. Crossing the Ohio River at Martin's Ferry, the family settled in Barnesville, Ohio. In Barnesville, she made a living as a washwoman. She had 3 more children, Edward, William, and Sylvester, as a free woman. Margarett Booker was born in slavery, February 1834, and died sometime after 1900 in Barnesville, Ohio. While she was a slave, she was tied to a tree and horsewhipped because she refused to lay with a master after having just birthed his 5th child with her. She died with the whip marks on her back. I had to find out more. I became hooked on family history in 1976 before Roots, but life happened. I got married, was a full-time researcher, technical writer, and manager for the California Highway Patrol's Selection Research Program. I had 2 sons and lived 2,500 miles away from the family members who could tell me about our history. There was precious little time for quality genealogy, let alone properly organizing and analyzing the documents I started collecting. It wasn't until I turned 60 that I got serious about genealogy. I listened in earnest to podcast interviews, and I read books featuring the kings and queens of Black genealogy like Nika Smith, Bernice Bennett, Melvin Collier, and I'm going to put the barefoot genealogist Krista Cowan in here too, because she provided a lot of great information for me. I developed a quick start method for writing family history books on October 1st, 2016. Chose one relative to focus my first book on, and finally started doing things correctly. Organize, analyze, then make timelines. Over and over, repeat it again. I used Dr. Shelley Murphy's ideas for organizing documents by family line, then by person within the family chronologically. I analyzed all the fields on each record, making timeline spreadsheets containing pertinent data, including census records from 1870 to 1910, birth and death records, court records, and significant historical events on that timeline to see how my family fared during history. Do you want to write a book of your findings? I encourage you to give my method a try. Step 1, do the 5-step focus exercise, which is this: who, why, where, what, and what. What do you already know and what do you want to know? Step 2, develop a research plan with 4 or 5 broad goals. My goals are always choose one person to write the book about, find out who the person's parents were, who the parents' descendants were up to the present time, okay? So parents and siblings is wide, descendants to the present time is deep, family tree, okay? And then I also obviously have to find out who the slave owner was and all of those records that that person may have, which may include my family's names, my enslaved family's names. And then can DNA help me find more relatives? Step 3, identify specific objectives for each broad goal, like the examples on the right. So this is what I actually prepared for Margarett Booker, the one on the right. The who is she, why did I choose her, where did she live, what do I already know about her? Those are all listed there. But what do you want to learn about that person? Okay, these are part of my goals and some of the specific objectives I'm interested in. The slave owner's full name and his family history. Was there more than one slave owner? Exactly where did Margarett live? Who was Margarett born in Beverly? Who were her parents and siblings? Was she a cook, a laundress, farm worker, or breeder? Who were Edward and Eve Backus? Who fathered her children? What is the derivation of her Booker surname anyway? How did she travel from West Virginia to Ohio during Civil War fighting? How did she live once in Ohio? What happened to her children? And can DNA prove familial connections with European and Africans? Well, here's a little what I learned from the 1870 census. Margarett Booker was living in Barnesville, Ohio with my great-great-grandfather, Job, now called Joseph, George, May, and Ella. They were all born in Beverly, Virginia, which became West Virginia. Cornelia was a live-in maid elsewhere in 1870. That's why she doesn't appear here. Were all 5 kids fathered by the enslaver? Job, who renamed himself Joseph, and George were students who were able to read but not write, which doesn't quite make sense to me, but Edward and William were born in Ohio to a different father. 79-year-old Edward Backus and his 70-year-old wife were also living with them. Who were they? Were the elders Margarett's parents? Even though the census only says Margarett was keeping house, she actually had a laundry business in her home, as did many Black women in Barnesville and other places. I needed to know more, up close and personal. In October 2019, I flew to Baltimore, Maryland to pick up a cherished book award at the Afro-American Genealogical and Historical Society conference in College Park. Since West Virginia was just next door, I took a 4-hour drive along winding roads to Beverly, Randolph County on the east side of West Virginia. It's the most beautiful place I had ever driven through during the fall. Woo! Caught in a rainstorm, I saw a building with a sign that read, "Welcome to Beverly." So I parked and sloshed inside. The dispatcher handed me a 3-inch binder of the town's history. I skimmed the pages. I noted that someone named Archibald Earle, E-A-R-L-E, donated 2 acres of his property for the main cemetery. I didn't know the exact name of the person who enslaved Margarett, but my elder pen pal Geraldine Booker thought the name was Earle, E-A-R-L-E. I vowed to scour every document in Beverly and the nearby county seat of Elkins to find enslavers named Earle and Booker. They recommended I visited the Beverly Heritage Museum. And here in this picture, you see the Stallknocker House, which we'll talk about in a second, and the Earle House, which is right next to the Tigert River. It was a gray, stormy Sunday afternoon. 2 hours before closing, I stepped back in time at the Beverly Heritage Center. Once I told the guy why I was there and who my family was, he excitedly showed me everything they had about African Americans there. Wasn't much. There were only 16 total blacks who lived in Beverly as of 1830, so there really wasn't much about their lives there, but there was a treasure trove of information about the Civil War, transportation, court cases from the 1800s. It's amazing. The building in this picture on the right, lower right, is the Beverly Heritage Center. It's like an amalgamation of 4 separate buildings, the old courthouse, the old general store, blah, blah, blah. So it's just really, really neat to go in there. Later, via my home computer, a newspaper article would lead me to exciting court meeting minutes about one of Margarett's close relatives. That is a thrilling chapter in the Mystery of Margarett Booker book. Oh, you can't believe what you can get from newspapers. The Beverly Heritage tour guide said black folks lived around the Fountain Street area after slavery ended. That's the upper right. After my tour, I drove through a pelting rain with my smart and trusty smartphone, videotaping the town. I imagined that the rundown wooden structures behind many houses were likely where the enslaved and newly freed had lived. My last morning in Beverly was spent at the courthouse. The head clerk showed me around the deed room and a small storage room where I could locate births, deaths, and plat maps. She cautioned me not to take photos with my smartphone. The woman was crazy. What do you mean? Not take pictures. I settled my laptop, notebook, and purse on a table and prepared myself mentally for hours of searching handwritten documents. But that didn't happen like I expected. I sat my computer bag on the round table shown in the picture. My eye trained on the only bright blue binder on the shelf. It was labeled Births 1853 to 1883. Inside the binder was an unattached single-page listing slave births and their owners. What? A slave named Margaret, with 2 T's, was at the bottom of the list. Margaret's owner was listed as J.B. Earle, E-A-R-L-E. The original birth document on page 26 could not be found in Book 1. None of the original slave documents were in Book 1. Well, I was still thrilled with the secondary typed information. I hit the jackpot at the start of my research. That document was the first to associate my 3 times great-grandmother's name with an enslaver named Earle. The ancestors want their story told, you better believe it. I spent the next 4 hours writing down every slave and enslaver record I found, constructing a 200-person database of African Americans in Randolph County. I shared this with the Beverly Heritage Center executive director and served as a consultant for a marvelous African American exhibit they prepared showing opening in 2022. Oh my gosh, this is it. Celebrate your research. This is what it's all about. Spreading the word, letting other people know about your heritage. The Beverly Heritage Center created an African Americans in Randolph County exhibit on Juneteenth, 2022, and here's my family. We represented Margaret. It was so exciting and thrilling. So at the left is the lady I still call our family historian, M. Myrtle Lavada Williams. She kind of gave up that mantle and I kind of assumed it, but to my mind, she's still the family historian. Then that's me, cousin Suzanne, cousin Nathan, and cousin Julie. They all came in from different parts, Ohio and Georgia and California. It was really, really thrilling. Now, this room, this exhibit had, on the left, you see this, it's like a 6-foot tall poster of our family and who they were. The lady in the middle of this picture, I don't know if you can see her, but between me and Lavada is Reba Williams. She was also an amazing family historian, lived to be 107 years old, was famous at 106 on the Jay Leno show. Stuff happens, folks. Okay, please time travel with me for a moment, if you would. In March 2020, on a sunny Saturday morning, I had the overwhelming urge to check the Beverly Heritage Center's Facebook page. I was happily surprised to learn they were offering history slideshows online during the COVID epidemic. One red rimmed slide stole my attention. A woman named Margaret with 2 T's. What? Was that my great-great-great-grandmother, Margarett Booker? Sure enough, it was a bill of sale written in 1846 for a 12-year-old girl named Margaret who was born around 1834. Mine. A man named John Stallnacker sold the girl and her future increase, which means any children she might have, to Elizabeth S. Earl for $1. Elizabeth was married to John B. Earl. When Elizabeth died in 1851, my Margaret became John Earl's sole property. Well, she became the sole property of John Earl. She began having children shortly thereafter, likely by her enslaver. He seemed to have a preference for the number 5. John Earl had 5 children with each of his 3 wives and, according to family lore, 5 by Margaret. This telling source was from the Oaths and Licenses book. Who would think of looking for a bill of sale there? Always look through your sources, folks, and never give up. And always look and relook, go back and look at the sources that you looked at last year, because stuff is being digitized now and you can find the pearls of wisdom. Okay, now this gets a bit complicated. I have to tease the truth out of various documents. Of course, every woman in that town was named Margaret or Elizabeth. So I shall continue to indicate my Margaret with 2 T's. The 1846 bill of sale revealed that my Margaret had 4 enslavers. The chart at the right, up above, attempts to clarify the players. John Stallnacker's mother, Margaret Elizabeth White Stallnacker, married a second time to a man named Richard Kittle. Kittle enslaved 2 females, named Peg and Phoebe. Note that Peg is a nickname for Margaret. They called her Ginger Cake Peg because the 6-foot-tall African, this is how she's described in a book, carried ginger cakes on a plate on her head, as Africans do, right? And she had a mug of beer on the other hand. She was selling beer and ginger cakes. That's how she made extra money. When Richard died in 1831, Peg was willed to his wife, Margaret E., John Stallnacker's mother. Phoebe was willed to Jane Kittle. Margaret E. sold Peg for $150, around 1832 or so. As of 1830, there were only 14 enslaved blacks and 2 free blacks in the Beverly area, and there were more in other parts of the area. But I think Peg was my Margaret's mother. Makes sense. There's so few blacks there, right? And you already know that Peg is owned by the Kittle family, who was married into the Stallnackers, who, anyway. So I talk about all of this in The Mystery of Margarett Booker and what Margaret's life may have been like, and how this may have occurred. There was one Civil War battle in Beverly on July 11, 1861. Local boy David Hart led Union soldiers through thick forests to claim victory over the rebels, who were staged on Rich Mountain. Beverly became a Union stronghold for the rest of the war. Many local enslavers fled with their families and their forced workers, seeking the safety of wholly Confederate states. My Booker family lived in the home of the county clerk, John B. Earl, in relative safety. I'm not sure how John Earl, in such a prominent position, could keep 6 enslaved people around those Yankees, but I guess that happened. A book called Civil War Legends of Rich Mountain and Beverly, West Virginia was indispensable to my research. Although there weren't any stories about my specific family, there were a handful about the black folk who lived in Beverly during the Civil War, and it clearly described other aspects of local life during that time. In 2022, when we visited, local resident Philip Lee, who's in the upper left of this picture, he told my family how African Americans hid in the forests atop Rich Mountain, right where we were standing, how they hid there during and after the Civil War. It was fascinating information. 1863 was a pivotal year for many. On January 1st, 1863, the Emancipation Proclamation freed enslaved workers in rebel states. In February, George and Hugh were freed by John Stallnacker, and Margaret reached her 29th birthday. In April, Margaret has a fifth child named Ella. That's about when she had the whip marks suddenly appeared on her back when she refused to lay with the master after she gave birth. In June, West Virginia became a Union state. Margaret's enslaver gave her a buckboard and told her to take her children to Ohio. But how did she do that? What route did she take? How did she navigate the tolls and possible ruffians and Civil War fighting along the way? I consulted with the Beverly Heritage Center executive director to determine how they might have traveled to Ohio. Maybe Hugh and George went with them. Who are Hugh and George? John Stallnacker owned two slaves named George and Hugh since 1830. They were under 10 as of 1830. John freed both men in his February 1863 will upon his death. And John bequeathed the leftovers of his estate after his children took their share to George and Hugh. Was that due to a familial relationship or just thanks for their loyalty? What does that have to do with the Booker name? Nothing. But our family has plenty of Booker DNA matches from Virginia, Cumberland, Westmoreland especially. I'm still researching that question. Where did the Booker name come from? This is an amazing story. Edward Ned Backus was finally emancipated from the Crouch family in 1854. After many court hearings in Beverly, the Crouches refused to free Edward's wife, Eve, and her two daughters. A series of articles from newspapers east of the Mississippi told the entire amazing story. Names, places, and why Edward traveled from Beverly to the Fusion, now called Republican, convention in Ravenna, Ohio. The articles told how Edward got a lawyer to pay $500 to free the rest of his family and reunite them in Ohio. In 1860, Edward's family was safe in Mount Union, Starks County, Ohio. They migrated to Barnesville, a Quaker town near an Underground Railroad hub. Barnesville became a haven for black folk, many of whom later moved to Mount Vernon, Ohio, and other places in central Ohio. It's possible that Edward and Eve were already living in Barnesville by 1863 and welcomed Margaret and her children to live with them. But what was Edward's relationship to Margaret, and where did Margaret get the Booker name? An 1899 marriage certificate for Margaret's son, named Edward H. Booker. He was born in about 1864 or 1865 in Ohio. It slammed the puzzle pieces together. This was a very important document. Margaret's son is Edward H. Booker. He's the groom. Edward married Minerva Myers in September 1899 in Belmont County, Ohio. Edward's father is listed as Hugh Booker. You see on the left, the second red rectangle down there on the left? Okay, so it says Edward's father is listed as Hugh Booker, the man that John Stallnacker freed in 1863. It says on the right side of the record that Margaret's maiden name was Backus, the same surname as Edward and Eve Backus, who she lived with in 1870. Was Edward named, son Edward, named for Grandpa Edward Backus? Probably. Was son Edward's middle name H for Daddy Hugh? Probably. Edward was her first child born in Ohio, so he wasn't sired, or I guess I'm not supposed to use that word, fathered by John Earl. So it all makes sense. It's in the record. It says Hugh was his father. Therefore, Hugh Booker made at least one baby with Margaret, Edward H. Booker, and I think he also fathered William and Sylvester, who came a few years later. Whether Margaret and Hugh were married is unknown. And in fact, I couldn't even find a record for Hugh after the 1870s. I couldn't find him at all, really. So I'm not positive where the Booker origins are from, but we do have DNA matches from Bookers in Virginia. So Margarett Booker was owned by four people during her 30 years of bondage in Beverly, West Virginia. During Civil War fighting, she and her five kids left newly created West Virginia to start a free life in Ohio. Margarett established a home laundry business in Barnesville, Ohio, where she lived with her father and stepmother and six children. She died in 1915, leaving behind a strong, resilient family who would not only survive, but thrive in America. And here's her lineage. From Margarett to the left, her son Joseph, his daughter Myrtle Booker Williams, her daughter Pearl Williams Carter, my grandmother, my mother, Mary Carter Marshall, and myself. Now, this is one of my most favorite devices. It's called an ancestor poster, and I learned about it from the Sons and Daughters of the United States Middle Passage. As you can see by the upper line, this one is about Margarett Booker. It's a place where you can put all of your data, all of your theories, all of your summaries, all of your everything on one page. And just think about having something like this for all of your ancestors, putting them in a book. All of your research is right there in one place. Cool. So let's start with the left side of this poster where it says spouse. So her spouse was Hugh Booker. Whether or not they were married or not, I don't know, but she had children by this man, and so he's going to be her spouse when she was in freedom. So the yellow box lists all of Margarett's children, 5 by the master, who may have been John Earl. John Earl was the master, but the children may or may not have been by him. Family lore says they were. Circumstances indicate that they were. DNA? Maybe not so convincing. But anyway, for this purpose, in yellow, the children with John Earl were Joseph, Cornelia, George, May, and Ella. By Hugh Booker, the children were Edward, William, and Sylvester. Below that is a, I don't know what you call that, light blue gray, and it talks about her relationship to me. So she was my 3 times great-grandmother, and then she lived 30 years enslaved and 50 years free. That's awesome. The last part talks about her father, Margarett's father, Edward Backus, and his wife, Eve. Now, whether Eve was Margarett's mother or not, I'm not sure. Might have been Ginger Cake Peg. I don't know. But anyway, so they lived together in the 1870 census. Now, whether Margarett was living with him or he was living with her, I don't know. In the so the picture up there is of Joseph Booker. That's my great-great-grandfather. That was Margarett's firstborn son, and he was born into slavery. But look at him. He's all sharp like that. That's how he dressed. He died with a huge library in his very nice house. He was a Mason. He was amazing. Okay. Below that is a picture of Margarett Booker. I don't have a picture of Margarett Booker, so I drew one. Maybe she looked like that. Maybe she didn't. In the center column, we have information about Margarett Booker herself. Born in 1834 in Randolph County, West Virginia. She died in 1915 in Barnesville, Ohio. Her occupation was listed as a housewife, but she really had a laundry business. She was a washwoman, and she lived on Vine Street in Barnesville. How did I find out about the enslaver, who the enslaver was? So this gives 3 major components to that. The first paragraph is the booklet, the genealogy booklet from 1983 that talked a little bit about this family and who the slave owner was. Didn't mention by name, though. In the middle, it's listed in the 1853 to 1883 Randolph County births. And so that was a huge find. And the Beverly Heritage Center, in the 3rd paragraph, in the yellow box in the center, they found a bill of sale that indicated that there were 4 owners altogether of Margarett Booker. I did not know that. That was fascinating. On the right side in orange, details of enslavement. Again, I start with that very important bill of sale, which had all the names of the slave owners and circumstances. I was able to put together a picture, a timeline of when things happened. And I could kind of guess when them babies started is when she became the property of John Earl. His wife had died. He's a lonely dude. He's got all these children at his house. What's a boy to do? Make more babies. It really is plausible that the father was John Earl, but again, DNA is a little light on that. So when Margaret was 21, she bore son Job, who later changed his name to Joseph. No document was found to corroborate the exact date that they left Beverly for Ohio. It's after the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863. I know that one child was born in 1864 or 5 in Ohio, so she was there by then. So somewhere in between 1863 and 1865 is when they left and they became free. Let's see, or they self-emancipated, let's put it that way. And then this is very interesting. In a 2003 Kenyon College interview, Margarett's grandson, George Booker, was interviewed by Professor Rick Sheffield. And this is where he says that, yeah, he, John Earl, had slaves and everything. He mentioned only one, and her name was Margaret. She was his wife's handmaid. Important information. When he set him free, he gave him a horse and a wagon. And he said to Joseph Booker, he said, please stay here and help me run the plantation. You grew up here. This is your home. You'll always have a home here. That's kind of sad. That kind of made the master to be kind of nice, even though he whipped Margaret on the back because she refused to lay with him a couple of days after she had given birth to his 5th child. So, is he a good guy? Is he a bad guy? He had slaves, but he was the clerk, the county clerk. It's a tough situation, isn't it? But anyway, it was fascinating. So this is what an ancestor poster looks like, and I encourage you to go ahead and try it. It really is helpful for you to get things straight in your mind as to what data you have and what you don't have. Wasn't that a pretty little story? But the DNA trail doesn't wholly match the paper trail. Lovatta Williams wrote in her 1983 genealogy booklet that after Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1st, 1863, the plantation owner freed Margarett Booker and her 5 children, and he also gave her a buckboard and a horse to pull the wagon. Lovatta did not specifically say John B. Earl was the plantation owner who fathered my 2 times great-grandfather, Joseph Booker. For someone who had 5 children with each of his 3 wives, and supposedly 5 with Margarett Booker, there should be a lot of DNA matches to the 14 or so family test kits that I administer. Sure, maybe none of his white descendants took DNA tests, but I have family members who have taken tests from all the available testing companies. The DNA evidence for John Earl being Joseph's father is underwhelming. I don't know how much you all are into DNA, but Ancestry.com is one of the leading DNA testing companies, and it gives you a tree and a whole bunch of other things. So, Ancestry has a tool called Throughlines, where it tries to determine of all the people who match you by blood, who actually share a common ancestor with you according to centimorgans in your blood. It's just a measurement of relationship. And so this Throughlines is a really cool tool. It's a hinting tool. It is not an end-all tool. It is based on people's trees. And if people's trees are not carefully validated, like mine is not, mine is a theoretical tree. I'm testing theories of parentage. So I warn people, don't copy things from my tree because I don't know that they're true yet. But Throughlines looks at who is blood related, because it can tell that by a scientific process and procedure, and then tries to determine from your trees who your common ancestors might be. So when I put John B. Earl, that's the one I'm looking for as being my 3rd great-grandfather. I run Throughlines for my great-uncle Charles Williams. He was 93 years old when I got his DNA. So it's the best DNA. It's the closest to the enslavement period. And so I run most of my tests against my great-uncle Charles Williams' DNA for that reason. So here is an example, a little printout, Throughlines for John Bales Earl. So the guy who supposedly is my 3rd great-grandfather, these are the number of people who match them. At the very bottom of the screen, you can see some pink circles At the top it says Through Lines for John Bales Earl. Through Lines uses ancestry trees to suggest that Charles Williams may be related to 14 DNA matches through John Bales Earl. 14 matches? That's cool. That's great. Until I look at what this says. So at the very top of the screen, you see the very first square is John Bales Earl, that he is the great-grandfather of Charles Williams. He was born in 1813 and died in 1881. Okay, so if this is true, then his daughter is Cornelia Booker, that he had with Margarett Booker. Their mixed-race daughter is Cornelia, and she has 3 DNA matches on her family line that have John Bales Earl in their family tree. When you look to the left, you see Joseph L. Booker. Okay, he is my great-great-grandfather. For sure, he was born into slavery and presumably is the son of John Bales Earl. According to this diagram, this is based on family trees. Okay, so it says he has, if you look down just right underneath his name, it says he has 11 DNA matches. Wow, guess who those people are? Me, my mother. It's my immediate family. That's all. There's nobody else, according to Through Lines, when this was run, that has John B. Earl in their trees except us. So that could mean a lot of things. It could mean that his family did not test. None of his descendants tested with Ancestry. You know, that's certainly a possibility. It could be that others don't have that name, John Bales Earl. They just have John B. Earl, or they just say John Earl. That's a possibility. I could redo my tree and just say that John Earl is my third great-grandfather and then run it again and see what happens. So there are a lot of possible reasons. Bottom line, it looks like it's just my family. And so that's why I have doubts that John B. Earl really is my third great-grandfather. Now, it could be his father. It could have been Archibald Earl that did the deed to plant the seed, but I'm pretty sure he was dead before my great-great-grandfather was born. It could be some other people in the Earl family, maybe. And the reason I say that is, so if we look at different generations of those Earls, so not just John B. Earl, but let's look maybe back at his grandparents or great-grandparents. There were several Earls named Samuel who do appear in many people's family trees. And this rendition of Through Lines shows that. There are a lot more people on the bottom row. These are living people on the bottom row. And they are blood related to me, and it looks like they're blood related through the Samuel Noah Earl line. That's what this shows us. And again, this is based on people's family trees being correct, and mine isn't necessarily correct, but it does show me that maybe this is okay. Now, the number of centimorgans, which is the closeness of the relationship, is small. You'll see at the very bottom, it's very hard to see it, but a lot of these are 12 centimorgans, 10, 8. They say now, Ancestry now says anything less than 8 is perhaps by chance, which is not true. You can go all the way down to 3 centimorgans, but because it takes a lot of database space, they've just chosen to only show down to 8 centimorgans. That's a very distant relationship because, again, we're talking about 3rd and 4th generations from Charles Williams, who was born in 1924, 100 years ago. So, yeah, we're talking about way, 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 way back people. So this is pretty extraordinary. So there are quite a few more folks who match me by blood, and it seems that they might match on the Samuel Noah Earl line. What does that mean? What does that mean? Does that mean John B. Earl is not my third great-grandfather, or it does mean that he is? It's just that his descendants didn't take DNA tests to be able to show up in a chart like this. I don't know what it means. I'm really open to your suggestions. We have several DNA matches to the Earl lineage from England from men named Samuel. So in the lower right-hand side, that's the England part. And this is kind of how I drew our migration from England all the way through. So you see all the Samuels down there, Samuel, Earl, the first, second, third, blah, blah, blah. And we are DNA matches to several people who have those names in their trees. And then you get back to Esaias Earl. These are when they're starting to migrate out of the original location where they landed. Archibald Earl is the father of the fellow who is our slave owner. John was our slave owner, John Bayless Earl, and maybe my third great grandfather all the way around. Okay, so, and then I am at the lower left. So that's my probable lineage. It's always a good idea to take a genealogy trip to the land of your ancestors. In 2023, I visited Bath, located in Somerset, England, where the Earl family held the position of Earl for many generations. In 1649, Sir John Earl I was given a land grant by King Charles II. I write about the Earl's epic journey in Chapter 2 of my The Mystery of Margarett Booker book. It was fascinating finding out the likely ship that they took and the types of foods and riches they may have brought with them to the New World in Virginia. Good question. Were Job, my second great-grandfather, and a white brother named Joseph born on the same day? The elders who knew Margarett Booker well told my first cousin once removed, Lavada Williams, that one of the master's wives gave birth to a white baby named Joseph on the very same day my second great-grandfather Job was born. So when Job arrived in Barnesville during the Civil War, he changed his name to Joseph to assert that he was a legitimate son of the master. That's the story that we were told. So if my third great-grandfather was not John Earl, who was he? The paper trail says it was John Earl, but DNA, I don't know. It's iffy. I need your help with this one. So that's about all I have for today. And I just want you to remember that when we write our history, we write the American historical record. I'd just like you to know the Mystery of Margarett Booker has stories of the Civil War era and other stories about her life as a free woman in Ohio. And it's available on Amazon and through online bookstores if you're interested in getting it. I know that I would love to share the life of my great-great-great-grandmother with you. It's a formidable story. It's a wonderful story. It's an uplifting story. And if it helps you to write your stories too, that's all the better. If you want to schedule me for a talk or a workshop, just contact me at Kathy@KathyLynneMarshall.com. And here's a sample of the books that have already been self-published. I really want to encourage you to write your stories now. You're doing the work, you're doing great work, but let's leave a written legacy to our families and to all families who need to know about our presence in America. We too are America, right? Okay, thank you very much. And we're going to have a Q&A session coming up right now.